Our scripture lesson this morning is a little unconventional, no narrative text this morning. I'm reading from the book of Psalms. I'm reading all of Psalm 37. Do not fret because of the wicked. Do not be envious of wrongdoers, for they will soon fade like the grass and wither like the green herb. Trust in the Lord and do good, so you will live in the land and enjoy security. Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in him, and he will act. He will make your vindication shine like the light, and the justice of your cause like the noonday. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret over those who prosper in their way, over those who carry out evil devices. Refrain from anger and forsake wrath. Do not fret. It leads only to evil. For the wicked shall be cut off, but those who wait for the Lord shall inherit the land. Here ends the lesson. May God transform understanding into action. Amen. So I've never felt this way before a sermon, full disclosure. I'm terrified. I've been terrified all morning. Ken asked me when I came in, what's wrong with you? You seem nervous. I mean, he asked nicer than that, but he was I'm not trying to throw Ken under the bus. I'm a little nervous this morning. I'm nervous because it's a difficult topic, and I'm nervous because you've heard the expression to thread the needle. There's only a couple ways to thread this needle, so we're going to do what we can. I read from the Psalms this morning because for a lot of people who woke up this morning, it was a time of, mourning. It was a time of grieving. For a lot of folks who were waiting yesterday with bated breath, watching the news, waiting to see what would happen next, and then to see, this final judgment, this final ruling. I'm talking, of course, about the Kavanaugh hearing. To have someone actively being carried out of the chamber, shouting, "Where is my representation?" while a room full of mostly men voted to decide to what extent this person might have some representation in the room. The reality is, parts of the system, our system, appear to be broken. And when you say what you think is broken, we call that getting political. Everyone agrees the system is broken. Our current president ran on the slogan, "Make America Great Again." The assumption is that it wasn't great, it needs to be made great again. Folks on the left say, well, no, it's not great anymore because we're moving too far to the right, so we need to swing more to the left. If we can just get everybody on the same side, then everything will be okay. That's getting political. That's trying to solve the problem and coming up with a solution, and that solution is tied to a particular ideology. But it's gotten to the point where sometimes it feels like we can't even talk anymore. Because to talk, even in an auxiliary way, is to get political. It's to cross a line, it's to betray the trust of the people that you're having the conversation with, because maybe those people didn't want to get political. So what I want to say this morning is, while I don't intend to tell you how to vote, I do intend to talk about things that intersect with our political system. And if that upsets you, that's okay. I'm going to talk about some things that are hard, and maybe it upsets you for reasons that don't have anything to do with politics. That's okay too. Maybe during the service You think to yourself, I need to go to the restroom. Head out. That's okay too. Whatever your reason for leaving this morning, if you decide to leave, I understand. But the reality is, I had a very long, miserable conversation with the woman that I love more than anyone in this whole world, who is terrified. Because as a woman, she feels like, rather than being an issue of left or right, Republican, Democrat, who's on the Supreme Court or who's not on the Supreme Court, the elephant in the room is that there's this other conversation about reproductive rights. There's this other conversation about power dynamics between men and women. There's this other conversation about what you're allowed to say and not allowed to say in polite company. And so then you can't really solve the problem because you're not allowed to talk about it. And she's terrified. I don't have any answers this morning. I'll admit it. I actively sat down with my wife and said, tell me what to tell them. Because I'm a dude and I don't get it. I don't get it. I get my experience, Some of you know, some of you don't. I'm bisexual. I'm a young bisexual man. There are predatory older men who sometimes prey on us. I've been on the receiving end of that, so I know what that feels like. I don't know what it feels like to be a woman. I'm sure it's a different dynamic. I just imagine it is. Every little thing about us changes the dynamics of how we interact with people in some way. I imagine that something as complicated as gender and biological sex, it's no minor thing. So I said, tell me what to tell them, and she said, I don't know, and I'm scared because she knows everything. I think it's the first time in all the years that we've been together, seriously, that I ever remember her looking at a system problem and shying away from it. Those of you who know my wife know she loves systems. She loves Excel sheets. Candace is in the back like, yeah, because they're of the same kind. They both love that kind of structure. So for her to look at a system and say, I don't know, I don't think it represents me anymore, I think it's broken, that's a scary thing. Now, she may not be there tomorrow, but she's there now. And I suspect for a lot of folks, maybe because you're a woman, maybe because you know that women are people too, but for whatever reason, I have a feeling a lot of folks are scared right now. So the good news is I don't have any answers for you. Why is that good news? It's good news because, to a certain extent, this is all part of the problem. To a certain extent, the idea that I have more credibility than you have just by virtue of being here is what gets us into these troubles in the first place. Because if somebody makes an accusation and it becomes my word versus your word, there's a power dynamic there. I don't know if any of you have ever had to, unfortunately, accuse a minister of anything, but if you have, and I have, by the way, it's not an easy process. It's not fun. The power dynamics, even as someone who is also clergy, it's a little weird. Institutions are designed to protect themselves, and they're designed to protect the people who are parts of those institutions so that those institutions can survive. There are plus sides to this, because if we know what we can trust, if we know that something's probably going to be there tomorrow when we wake up the next day, that gives us a sense of safety. We call that faith. We don't necessarily realize it's faith, but it's faith. If I turn over my engine in the morning, I assume it's going to crank. If I back out of the driveway, I assume my car isn't going to explode. I'm acting on faith. I have evidence, by the way, that my car isn't going to explode if you ever have to ride in the car with me for any reason. My car's fine. But I'm just saying, I'm assuming that everything is fine based on what information I have, but ultimately, I have to make a leap. Not working with all the information. And so institutions help cut down that anxiety we have when we have to make those leaps. We make appeals to authority and we say, well, someone in charge said it, so it's true. Must be true. Someone in charge said it. That's how you know. Well, how do you know they're supposed to be in charge? Well, they said they were supposed to be in charge. And we get into this cycle of inherited authority. So I think, to a certain extent, seeing some people as up here and some people as down here and letting our institutions reflect that is part of the problem. So I don't have an answer for you this morning because I realize that as a minister in an institution that has been part of the problem, I can do what I can from the inside. You can do what you can from the inside, but institutions have their attributes. And if you look at the history of human beings, we looked at the history of the church last month, there's a lot of this checks and balances thing that we talked about. So the first 500 years, it's pretty unorganized. Then the church has to organize. That's the medieval days, right? Then it's too organized, and so then we have the Reformation because there are too many people with too much power, and no one can call them out on anything. And then the authorities of the Reformation have to be critiqued. Martin Luther was a giant anti-Semite. We need to own that. So then the church issues apologies, learns from the best aspects of Luther, and then moves on. Right? That's the whole history of our institution, is getting a little too much power accumulated in one area and realizing we need to break it down. Over time, my belief is that the church will eventually deconstruct itself into nothingness. That's the goal. When Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is within you, and when Jesus says you are all the people of God, I think that's what he's talking about. I think we'll get to a place where we don't have churches anymore, and Christianity will keep going. This is a building. This is an institution. This isn't even an institution that's permanent to the history of our faith. We didn't even have churches like this for so long. So something else will come and replace it. But it will replace it because we'll have to have conversations about how power is organized and who is represented and who gets to participate in that process, which is why it's so important to understand what we mean by communion. Today is World Communion Sunday. I was really excited about World Communion Sunday until I realized that this wasn't going to go away and that the two were just going to have to connect. But I realized something that I think has been the lesson, and it's something that I think if you're a vulnerable person or you've ever been put in a situation where you are the vulnerable person, it's something that you probably already understand. But I think those of us with some privilege and some of us who just haven't suffered as much or who haven't had those experiences sometimes need to be made aware. Communion is not kumbaya. What I mean by that is when we say, can't we all just get along? When we say that we're building a church or a place for all God's people, when Isaiah, for example, in the scripture says, my house shall become a house of prayer for all peoples, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to allow yourself to be abused. I know that seems like a really obvious and silly thing to have to say, but the truth is institutions sometimes tell people that, no, it's your lot in life to take this. For the good of the institution, you should keep your mouth shut. For the good of the institution, you shouldn't talk about this. You know, we're really going through a rough fundraising patch right now, and if you could just not talk about it, that would just be great. But communion, the thing that we're called to do as a church, the thing that we're going to do this morning as a church, is not Kumbaya. You know the song Kumbaya? Interesting history of that song. Nobody really knows where it starts, where it originates. We think it might originally have been a Gullah song, but we don't actually know. It was butchered by white missionaries over time. And then interestingly enough, the particular white minister who was responsible for popularizing the song then got into a lawsuit to protect his rights. So it's an interesting story. Kumbaya, my lord, kumbaya. Hold on a second. I'm not getting my royalty checks like I expected. Kumbaya is something that we often roll our eyes at when we hear because it evokes this idea that we're all just going to get along and everything's just going to be okay and we can just magically wave a wand. Kumbaya. Pie in the sky by and by is another expression. Communion isn't that. Communion isn't letting yourself be abused for the sake of an institution that may or may not care about you as much as you are taught to care about it. When Jesus said, "This is my body and this is my blood," he was about to die. So communion with him, unity with Christ in that moment, was unity with someone who was suffering. It was taking a side. Communion isn't, can't we all just get along? Communion is, some things are okay and some things aren't, and when they're not, we don't have to stand for it. And when our institutions tell us it's okay, you have to stand for it, don't listen to them. Church included. The history of the church is church authorities telling people on the lower lungs of the ladder, you can't do this, and they do it anyway. Turns out it works out. Martin Luther is a great example. Just some paper and some nails. So this week, I have no invitation to you other than this. Talk about it. If there are things that you feel right now that you're being told you shouldn't, that it would be better if you just let it go, but it's eating away at you, or it's hurting you in some way, communion doesn't mean you have to suffer for someone who is predatory in all the ways that can be. It can be, sexual predators. It can be people who are predatory in other ways. People like to back people into corners. And you don't have to take that. Communion, not kumbaya. One last note. When my parents were going through a divorce, there was abuse in the home, and we went to a minister friend for counseling. My dad famously won't see a counselor who isn't a Christian because he knows he'll have a better chance of being told he's not an abuser if he sees a counselor who's not a Christian, so he goes to see a counselor who is a Christian. So we go together as a family, and the counselor says to me, finally, after my parents have been talking around me this whole time, I'm still fairly young, counselor says, "How do you feel about this?" And I said, "It doesn't really matter, because it's pretty obvious that there are cycles of abuse that are still playing themselves out here, and until someone says this is not okay, it's going to keep happening." The church didn't do anything. They never did. We can't. I had no advocate. I had no advocate as a man with a lot of privilege, right? Because I can pretend that nothing ever happened to me and you won't ever know. I can pretend like, I don't think about it, that it doesn't bother me. Privilege. And even with all of that, it still bothers me. It still comes up. That church failed. We don't have to. Jesus invites us into a new kind of unity. It's not an easy unity. We're sticking up for people who don't often get stuck up for. But that's the beauty in it. Won't you join me?